Architected original YouTube narrative about subterranean discovery within specified parameters. Architected original YouTube narrative about subterranean discovery within specified parameters. The ground doesn't usually invite you in. Most of the time it just sits there, solid and silent, keeping its secrets buried under 100 years of dust and collapse. But 3 weeks ago, on a hillside I've walked past more times than I can count, I found a crack barely wider than my hand. And that crack turned out to be a door into a world that hadn't seen daylight or a single human footstep in over a century. I live out here on the edge of an old mining district, the kind of place where the mountains are hollowed out underneath like a piece of Swiss cheese, riddled with shafts and tunnels dug by men chasing silver and gold more than 100 years ago. When you live somewhere like this long enough, you start to think you've seen it all. I've spent years crawling through collapsed adits, mapping old workings, and cataloging whatever the miners left behind. And after a while, that familiarity breeds a kind of blindness. You stop looking at the hillsides the way you did when you first arrived. You take the same trail, you glance at the same rock outcrop, and you assume that if there was something to find, you already would have found it. That assumption almost cost me the discovery of my life, because a few months back, I forced myself to break that pattern. Instead of taking the worn path I always take in the evenings, I started cutting off trail, scrambling up loose scree, pushing into gullies I'd never bothered with before. Most of the time it led to nothing more than a rabbit den or a rusted tin can from some long-forgotten camp. But every so often I'd find the telltale signs of old mining activity, a squared-off timber sticking out of the dirt, a pile of tailings that didn't belong on a natural slope, or a small depression that hinted at a collapse portal. Most of those little prospects went 10 or 15 feet into the hillside and stopped, choked off by decades of rockfall. I'd learned not to get my hopes up. Then, on an otherwise unremarkable evening walk, I found 2 collapsed openings sitting side by side, half buried under loose rock, positioned in almost exactly the spot where old survey records suggested one of the district's largest and richest ore bodies should have been. I'd read about that ore body for years. It was a kind of deposit that built fortunes in towns, a nearly vertical seam of silver and lead, what the old-timers called a chimney, because they ran up to the rock the way smoke runs up a flue. According to every account I'd ever read, that particular chimney had collapsed in on itself decades ago and had never been re-entered. I had walked past this exact hillside more times than I could count, and never once suspected what might be sitting just beneath the surface. I started digging with nothing more than my hands and a small shovel, half expecting to hit solid rock within a few feet. Instead, the opening kept going. I squeezed through a narrow crawl space, my chest scraping against stone on both sides, and the passage dropped away into a small chamber, then kept sloping downward into darkness. That was the moment I knew this wasn't another dead end. I turned around, hiked back to get rope and climbing gear, and came back the next day with every intention of finding out exactly how far this thing went. The first real attempt at getting deeper almost ended before it began. The passage opened into what looked like a massive void choked with loose, unstable rock, the kind of slide where every stone seems to be resting precariously against its neighbor, with nothing solid to anchor to, rappelling into something like, that is genuinely dangerous. If the rope pulls the wrong rock loose, or if a boulder that's been sitting in place for 100 years decides that today is the day it finally shifts, there's no walking away from that. I backed out, climbed back to the surface, and came back with proper bolts so I could anchor into solid stone instead of trusting my life to a pile of loose debris. With a secure anchor in place, I lowered myself down into the dark, and almost immediately the mountain started handing me pieces of the past. A scrap of fabric caught my headlamp first, denim so old and stiff it had practically fossilized, complete with a cinched waistband that hadn't been in fashion for 100 years. A few feet further, a leather glove, cracked and shrunken but unmistakably a glove, sitting exactly where its owner had set it down or dropped it, untouched ever since. Finding personal items like that does something strange to you underground. It's easy to think of an old mine as just geology, just rock and tunnel. But a glove sitting on a ledge is a reminder that a person was standing right there, doing a job, breathing that same air at some point in a century that has otherwise vanished. As I kept descending, the space around me kept expanding in ways I hadn't anticipated. What I thought was going to be a single collapsed shaft opened into an enormous excavated chamber, easily 60 feet from floor to the ceiling, and just as wide, with old electrical cables strung along one wall, evidence that at some point in this mine's long history, someone had run power down into these depths. That single detail told me a lot. The earliest miners here worked entirely by candlelight, decades before electricity ever reached underground workings like this. So this space, as ancient as it felt, had been touched by at least two very different eras of mining, separated by years, maybe decades, of dormancy in between. From that main chamber, passages branched off in every direction, down into more chambers below, up into levels I couldn't see the top of, sideways into corridors that disappeared around corners into blackness. I stood there in the beam of my headlamp trying to process the scale of it, and it genuinely felt like I had just discovered that my own house had another house hidden beneath its foundation. Every direction I turned revealed another opening, another shaft, another unexplored section of mine I thought I already knew intimately after years of exploring this district. The artifacts kept coming. An old carbide lamp, remarkably intact, sitting exactly where a miner had left it. A rusted wheelbarrow, its wooden handles somehow still holding together. Wooden crates stamped with the markings of a dynamite manufacturer, some still holding their original contents, undisturbed for a century. A boiler, massive and corroded, tucked into a side chamber, too heavy and impractical to ever have been hauled back out once the mine went quiet. And scattered throughout, fragments of old newspaper, brittle and yellowed, stuffed into cracks or used wrap items for storage, the printed dates on them acting like little timestamps scattered through the darkness. One of those newspaper fragments gave me a date, 1925, tucked in near a section of the workings that also contained more modern equipment. The electrical cable, a large industrial wheel or spool mechanism, ventilation infrastructure. That told me I was standing in a section of the mine that had been reworked during a later industrial period, likely when a different mineral, one that had been ignored by the original silver-focused miners, suddenly became valuable enough to justify sinking new infrastructure into old ground. But the deeper I pushed, the story started to shift again. I found a section where the timber framing changed completely. Instead of the more sophisticated interlocking support structures used in later mining operations, this timbering was crude, mismatched, logs simply wedged wherever they'd fit. The kind of improvised bracing you'd expect from the earliest days of a mining operation, before more advanced engineering techniques had been developed or adopted. The nails holding scraps of wood together were square-cut, a manufacturing style that fell out of common use by the early 20th century, replaced by the round wire nails we still use today. Square nails are one of those small details that quietly date a site better than almost anything else you can find underground. In that same older section, I found tallow candles, the kind of lighting used before carbide lamps became standard, and eventually a second newspaper fragment, legible enough that I could make out a date, 1897. That put me almost 30 years earlier than the electrical cable and dynamite crates I'd found higher up in the same system. I was standing in a single connected mine, but one that had clearly been worked, abandoned, and reworked across two entirely different eras separated by decades, each leaving its own distinct layer of debris behind like sediment. And then, in that oldest section, tucked into a narrow stope where the walls themselves seemed to shimmer under my light, I found what the earliest miners here had actually been chasing. Streaks of galena, a lead silver ore, ran to the rock in visible veins, more concentrated and more extensive than anything I'd documented anywhere else in this entire district. Standing in that chamber, surrounded by hand-chipped rock and century-old timber, I finally understood why the specific spot had been worth the effort of digging this deep, this far back, with nothing but candlelight and hand tools. The ore was simply everywhere. Bringing everything I'd found back to the surface and laying it out felt like assembling a timeline out of physical evidence rather than written history. On one end, the 1897 newspaper, the tallow candles, the felt hat that would held a candle in front of a miner's face, the crude hand-hewn timbering, and the square nails, all belonging to the earliest silver rush that first drew people to dig into this mountain. On the other end, the 1925 and 1926 dated materials, the carbide lamps that replaced open candle flames sometime around the turn of the century, the dynamite crates from A, manufacturer that only came into existence after federal antitrust action broke up an earlier explosives monopoly, and the electrical infrastructure that marked a more industrialized, better-funded phase of mining focused on an entirely different mineral than the one the original prospectors had been after. What struck me most wasn't just the age of what I found, but how completely undisturbed all of it was. No looters, no previous explorers, nothing moved or picked over. Every artifact sat exactly where its last owner had set it down, sometimes mid-task, before the passage collapsed and sealed the entire section away from the world. In a district that has been picked through, documented, and explored for well over a century, finding a section that had somehow slipped through every survey and every previous explorer's notice is about as rare as it gets. It's the kind of thing you spend years hoping for and mostly never find. There's a particular feeling that comes from standing in a space like that, one that's hard to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it firsthand. It isn't just excitement, though there's plenty of that. It's something closer to responsibility. Every mine like this represents real history that was never written down in any book, preserved only in the objects left behind and the marks left on the rock itself. When you're the first person to see it in 100 years, you're not just exploring, you're recovering a piece of the past before it's lost for good, whether to further collapse, erosion, or simple forgetting. I've spent 6 years exploring this mountain, documenting the shafts, reading every historical record I could get my hands on, and I genuinely believed I had a fairly complete picture of what was down there. This discovery proved otherwise, and it did it in the most humbling way possible. Not through some dramatic expedition or months of planning, but through a crack in the ground I'd probably walked past 100 times before, on an evening walk I almost didn't take. It's a reminder that no matter how well you think you know a place, there's almost always more beneath the surface, quite literally in this case, waiting for someone willing to look a little closer, dig a little further, and follow a small crack in the ground to see exactly where it leads. And if this experience taught me anything, it's that I'll never look at another hillside the same way again, because now I know that even the ground I thought I understood completely can still be hiding an entire lost world just beneath my feet.